So thanks for having me here. In case you are completely fed up with the future, and after the two previous presentations, I might share the sentiment, I'm going to make it worse. Because this is the third angle, which focuses on conflict and its intersection with communication technologies, but also, of course, future. It is grounded in the MLPAT project, but with also some spin-offs when it comes to MetaMath. I won't talk too much about methodology, despite Miloš his promise, but we'll be happy then to answer questions if that comes up, and if you need a bit more clarification. What is important is that we had actually 5 of these projects. One or 2 others here is on gender and on toxic debates. So you just have 3. We could have depressed you more with 5, but I think this was more than sufficient. They had shared data, shared methodology, but actually had a different theoretical framework and actually quite different outcomes, although some outcomes were also similar, and I'll come back to that. This one was, this project was done with a colleague, Italian colleague, and there was also a touchscreen.
It's not agreed that now the arrows.
Now it doesn't touch. Maya, what did you do?
The arrows will be yes.
Just need to touch the screen and then press the arrow. So what was particular, of course, what is particular in the case of this project is, of course, the focus on conflict. Now, the notion of conflict is a bit tricky because there are 2 main traditions of conflict studies. One is equates violent conflict and conflict. So when they talk about, and that's not my approach, when they talk about conflict, they actually mean immediately armed conflict and violent conflict. There is also a much broader approach in conflict studies, which looks at a whole range of disputes that could be solved in more peaceful ways, or that could be solved in more violent ways, or could not be solved at all, as we've often seen. And that, of course, connects to the work that also obviously is grounded in this dimension of antagonism, creations of enemies, versus agonism, creation of adversaries, which is very much in line with Chantal Mouffe's way of thinking about conflict. So I use this broad perspective, which also allows me to identify something like democratic conflict and not only talk about armed conflict. At the same time, armed conflict in itself is sort of important. We haven't gotten rid of war for millenniums, so it's has been with us for a very long time, and of course we need to acknowledge its importance. In between, though, there is something which is gray zone conflict, which is the use of more violent techniques in a fairly peaceful environment, and that's also what in contemporary periods that we are seeing quite a lot. Cutting cables is probably one of the more contemporary examples of gray zone conflict. Discussions about the different generations of armed conflict, I won't take you there, but be aware I'm using a very broad definition of conflict, which allows me to look also at democratic conflict. The second point, when we then bring in communication technologies, I think we need to be a bit careful in getting locked into media deterministic positions. I don't want to privilege the field of media studies, but as media studies scholars and communication studies scholars, we can't resist the temptation at the same time. So we need to find that balance between technological, but also determined technologies. And finding that in between is quite important, acknowledging the importance of communication technologies in the context of these different types of conflict. In the case of armed conflict, one obvious, and we were talking about this before, one obvious example is the use of media propaganda as a way to construct enemies. And if you have a look at our history of propaganda, you'll find quite some charming examples on how to construct the other. But what we have seen now is what, with a lot of cynicism, a number of people, including myself, have called the democratization of propaganda, where more and more actors become involved in the process of the production of propaganda. In gray zone conflict, we have these wonderful discussions on cyber war. The Estonians have some history there because they were quite fortunate to get a big blow in with the cyber attacks related to the bronze soldier, a statue that was going to be moved. In the case of democratic conflict, we should also keep in mind that information can actually be a trigger for conflict. Right? It is not something that is outside of conflict. We find struggles over and in public opinion, and that is very much part of the logics of democratic conflicts, with again a gray zone area, violence that can down. Almost there. That can the future awaits us. So symbolic violence that also is obviously connected to gray zone conflicts, but it's very much still integrated in the logics of democracies itself, having a certain degree of tolerance, which is the debate in it. Now, great. This is the setting. When we look at technology, we look at conflict. How do then people think about what the future will bring us of that intersection? And that was our research question. I should immediately emphasize that if we look into future studies, there are a few issues. There are a few issues with future studies. Actually, the right name of the field is futures studies. They use the plural to already indicate that there are some ontological problems in trying to predict futures. I'm not going to go there aware of these discussions. What we, as a response to that ontological issue, what we became interested in is how do groups of experts construct the future? What kind of constructions do they offer? What kind of imaginings of the future? Not trying to predict the future, but trying to understand how people think about the future, which is close, but definitely not the same. If we go into futures studies, we have a distinction between forecasting, scenario building, and backcasting. They're all great, but future studies and forecasting does produce some ontological issues. We were much more inclined to go to scenario building and look at how people construct the future, where there's not much of a prediction of what will actually materialize. And that's a key difference. Now, I won't go into backcasting, but that's actually quite a fun technique as well, where you then try to imagine a future and then look at what steps you need to take desirable future, or which steps you need to take to prevent that undesirable future from realizing itself. The second big issue with future studies is that it was famously untheoretical. And only fairly recently we've seen a number of publications that actually started to think about theories of future studies. And this is from 2015. One of the areas is very close to what we have been doing, the socioeconomic measures in the construction of futures, but also here, the socio-technological practices, which brings in social constructionism to finally theorize future studies. So that is a bit of the discussions that we got locked into. We decided to work with experts. I think our two presenters before me have already emphasized that there are a few people you might recognize, including Milos, who's sitting there, predicting the future, so to speak. These expert working groups, so to speak, created a whole set of scenarios of different areas, including scenarios about conflict and communication technology. And now I'm going to depress you. Obviously, there was a dominance of negativity with 4 scenario clusters that were all sort of not fun. The most radical was the power takeover, the idea that communication technologies would be a full coup, a full machine takeover. There were 2 other scenario groups that focused on the intensification of conflict, intensification of armed conflict, and of democratic conflict. And there was a bit of a separate looking at the harm that we do in engaging in conflicts, but also actually setting up conflict with, for instance, the environment. These four negative ones were connected mainly to two assemblages: media corporations and technology assemblage, and military and technology assemblage. There was a bit of a capitalist assemblage as a third one, but they connected less obviously to. So the happy one, the power takeover. Corporate platforms take over the robotization of in real life conflict, but this is a quote. Their algorithms will basically change public opinion any way they like. Right? This is a very negative, anxiety-driven scenario group. Second, intensification of armed conflict, communication as weapon, civil war. So here's the idea that, for instance, communication technologies will enhance conflict in society and thus contribute to a military situation, military response, for instance, through the logics of civil war. Cyber war is mentioned quite often. Fragmentation of armed conflicts is there one example. 3, intensification of democratic conflict, which is actually borderline with, and again, this connects to military and technological assemblage, where we talk about the weaponization of information, the militarization of information, causing hypes, causing, I guess that the more fashionable term now is polarization, causing polarization. Harm, partially crime, but there's a lot of emphasis on the environment, the harm that we do. Now, is there no hope? Were our experts like only preventing or predicting a dark future? Well, they were actually, and that was probably the most fascinating discussion, there were 2 areas of hope. One, and that completely surprised me, international and supranational organizations were locations of hope. And guess or not, the EU. There was a very strong emphasis and a very positive EU. There were a few, like deep down in the discussions, there were a few question marks that people put with the EU as the rescuer of the European community from armed conflict, but that was minimal. They were locations of hope. European institutions will take the leadership, the EU government will control and provide, for instance, a safe digital space. This is a construction of the future. This is not necessarily a prediction in the future. And whether this is realistic is something we can obviously put some question marks. Still, there is an imaginary of institutions creating hope for the prevention or the reduction of conflict. The second one is cultural change. And that's quite fascinating for a number of reasons. It's fascinating because there's quite a strong emphasis on the creation, and we go to creation of a mutual understanding between machines and humans. If you feel the matrix coming, then you're pretty good there. The creation of cyber defense. So there's a whole idea that we can actually change how we do things. What is left out, and that's the second point, is any kind of traditional materialist perspective. As if that the base, to use that term, the base is not there. It's not part of any kind of discussion. So allow me to wrap up and appease the chair. It's not an easy discussion because both the notion of conflict and the notion of communication theory is actually quite fluid. And we didn't want to impose any kind of clear preset definitions on how the participants, the experts, would think about that. So we left that open, and that, of course, created a fairly difficult set of scenarios. The diversity of communication technologies and community practices obviously created that complexity. What is the most important, I think, point to make is that if we look at the scenarios, there was a very strong dominance of de-escalation into violence. And there is a deep concern with the experts, and I suppose that by now we will share that. There's a deep concern that technology may be abused, actually enhance different forms of conflict, hence the anxiety triggering scenarios which are omnipresent. In those negative scenarios, we have two villains, if you allow me to use a little narratological language. And the villains are basically the communication technology companies and the military, as assemblages that are deeply problematic. There is little to no trust there with the experts. There is hope because the EU will save us. And with these lovely words about how our experts think about the future, I'll end up this presentation and we'll come back to that maybe later if there are some questions. Thank you.